What if the most powerful man in the world knew he was destroying everything he touched? What if every mirror showed him not a king, but the living proof of his family's failure? This is the story of Charles II of Spain. For 35 years, he ruled an empire that spanned 4 continents, but he spent every single day knowing that with his death, 200 years of his family's legacy would die with him. He wasn't just a victim of genetics. He was a man who understood exactly what he was losing and chose to keep trying anyway. To understand Charles's impossible burden, you must first grasp what he inherited. The Spanish Habsburg Empire wasn't just large, it was a global colossus that defied comprehension. From the silver mines of Potosi in Bolivia to the spice islands of the Philippines, from the fortress cities of the Spanish Netherlands to the sun-baked plains of Castile, Charles ruled over territories so vast that the sun literally never set on his dominions. But by 1665, when little Charles ascended this mighty throne, the empire was already showing dangerous cracks. Endless wars had drained the royal treasury despite rivers of New World silver. Portugal had successfully rebelled in 1640. The Dutch had won their independence after 80 years of brutal fighting. French armies were pushing into Spanish territory in the Low Countries and Italy. Yet the empire remained enormous, still the largest political entity on earth, and now it rested in the hands of a child who could barely speak. Charles II didn't just inherit an empire, he inherited an impossible dream. His ancestors had conquered half the world, but they'd made one fatal mistake. They believed their blood was so sacred, it could only mix with itself. The Habsburg obsession with bloodline purity had created what modern geneticists call a genetic catastrophe. To understand just how extreme this became, we need to look at Charles's family tree. Though calling it a tree is generous, it resembles more a tangled web that folds back on itself in ways that defy nature. Charles's great-great-great-grandmother was Joanna the Mad of Castile. His great-great-great-grandfather was Philip the Handsome. Here's where it gets disturbing. Those two people appear as ancestors in Charles's family tree, not twice, not 4 times, but 14 separate times. Every single one of Charles's great-grandparents descended from this same couple. His parents, Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. But it goes deeper. Mariana was also Philip's cousin through multiple other lines. This made Charles simultaneously his father's son, great-nephew, first cousin, and second cousin, relationships that shouldn't be able to exist in the same person. Modern geneticists have calculated Charles's inbreeding coefficient at 0.254, meaning 1/4 of his genes were identical copies inherited from the same ancestors. To put this in horrifying perspective, this level of inbreeding exceeds what you'd expect from a brother-sister union. Charles was more inbred than the offspring of siblings would be. The Habsburgs had spent 2 centuries systematically destroying genetic diversity in their bloodline. Charles V had married his first cousin Isabella of Portugal. Philip II had married his first cousin Maria Manuela, then his sister-in-law Mary I of England, then his niece Elizabeth of Valois, then his 4th cousin Anna of Austria. Each generation, the genetic noose tightened. By the time Charles was born in 1661, his family tree had become a biological impossibility. His 8 great-grandparents represented only 4 distinct genetic lineages. Where a normal person would have 16 different great-great-grandparents, Charles had just 6. The Habsburg obsession with pure blood had created something that shouldn't have survived. But Charles did survive, and that survival came with a terrible awareness that he was the living embodiment of his family's genetic destruction. But here's what the history books miss. Charles wasn't born unaware. Court records show that even as a small child, he understood he was different. When he couldn't walk at age 3 while other children ran through the palace halls, when words wouldn't form properly in his mouth, when servants looked at him with barely concealed pity, he knew. A Venetian ambassador wrote, "The prince seems to understand everything that happens around him, though he cannot express himself clearly." Charles was trapped in a failing body with a mind sharp enough to comprehend his own tragedy. When his father died and Charles became king at 4 years old, something remarkable happened. This child, who could barely speak, began trying to learn the art of ruling an empire that stretched across 4 continents. Palace tutors described a boy who would sit through hours of lessons he could barely follow, determined to understand statecraft. Charles would listen with intense concentration, his malformed jaw hanging open, struggling to absorb information about governing a quarter of the world's inhabited land. Think about the courage that required. Every day, Charles woke up knowing he was failing his subjects before he even tried. The Spanish people called him El Hechizado, the bewitched, and he could hear the whispers. Yet he kept showing up to council meetings, kept trying to make decisions for an empire that needed strength he couldn't provide. His personal secretary recorded that Charles would often ask, "Am I doing right by Spain?" The question haunts because it reveals a man who cared deeply about his duty, even as his body betrayed every attempt to fulfill it. Charles lived his entire life surrounded by people who needed him to be something he could never become. Courtiers who watched his every stumble, subjects who prayed for a miracle, foreign ambassadors who reported his weaknesses to enemy courts. The Spanish court was the most rigid in Europe, bound by an etiquette so complex it could take hours to complete simple ceremonies. Charles had to endure endless rituals where his physical limitations were painfully obvious, masses where he couldn't kneel properly, state dinners where he couldn't eat without assistance, reception ceremonies where foreign dignitaries struggled to understand his slurred speech. But the most heartbreaking accounts come from his servants, the only people who saw him as human rather than symbol. His valet, Andres de Molina, wrote that Charles would sometimes ask him to just sit quietly in the room, so I don't feel so alone with my thoughts. The king of the world's largest empire was asking a servant to keep him company. When courtiers suggested he was possessed by demons, Charles reportedly said, "If I am cursed, it is not by devils, but by those who came before me." He understood that his suffering wasn't supernatural. It was the price of his ancestors' choices. Charles's marriage to Marie Louise d'Orléans in 1679 represents one of history's most tragic attempts at human connection. The marriage was arranged to strengthen the alliance between Spain and France, but Marie-Louise knew she was essentially being sacrificed to Spanish political needs. When she arrived from the refined court of Versailles, palace observers expected disaster. Here was a beautiful, intelligent woman about to meet a king whose appearance had horrified foreign diplomats. The French ambassador had written back to Louis XIV, "His Catholic Majesty is so ugly as to cause fear, and he looks ill." But something unexpected happened. Marie-Louise, after the initial shock, began to see past Charles's deformities. She discovered that behind the grotesque exterior was a man desperate for kindness and understanding. Letters between them, preserved in the Spanish royal archives, reveal an unlikely but genuine affection. Marie-Louise wrote to her aunt, "The king is not what I expected, but he tries so hard to be good to me that I cannot help but feel affection for him." She described how Charles would spend hours learning French phrases to surprise her, his speech so slurred that she had to listen carefully to understand his efforts at romantic words. Charles, for his part, found in Marie-Louise something he had never experienced: acceptance. She didn't flinch when he drooled during meals. She didn't look away when his jaw hung open. She even learned to understand his garbled Spanish and would translate for visitors who couldn't follow his speech. Their tragedy wasn't just that they couldn't have children, though that failure haunted them both. It was that they had found something real, two people connecting across an impossible gulf, and everyone around them saw only political failure. The Spanish court watched obsessively for signs of pregnancy. Every month that passed without an heir was seen as another step toward dynastic collapse. Marie-Louise endured examinations by court physicians, consultations with specialists, and constant pressure from courtiers who blamed her for the lack of children. But Charles knew the truth. His body was failing him in every possible way, and he understood that the fault wasn't Marie-Louise's. Private letters show him defending her against court criticism, insisting that God would provide an heir in his own time. When Marie-Louise died suddenly in 1689 after a horseback ride, complaining of severe stomach pains, Charles's grief was so profound that he couldn't function for weeks. Modern historians believe she likely died of appendicitis, but the timing was suspicious enough that rumors of poisoning spread immediately. Charles had lost more than a wife. He had lost the only person who had ever seen him as worthy of love rather than pity. As Charles aged, his body deteriorated, but his mind remained clear about what was happening. He knew he was the last of his line. His death would trigger a war that would tear Europe apart, and was presiding over the end of Spanish dominance. His second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg in 1690 was purely political, arranged to provide one last chance for an heir. But Charles's condition had worsened dramatically. By his 30s, he was already an old man, bald, toothless, barely able to walk, suffering seizures that left him unconscious for hours. The question of succession consumed European politics. With no direct heir, the Spanish Empire would pass to distant relatives, and every major power had their preferred candidate. Louis XIV of France supported his grandson, Philip of Anjou. Emperor Leopold I of Austria backed his son Archduke Charles. The choice would determine whether France or Austria dominated Europe for the next century. In his final years, Charles would visit the tombs of his predecessors, but not because he was losing his mind, as many historians have suggested. Spanish court records show he was studying their reigns, trying to understand how to preserve what they had built. He spent hours reading the wills and final testaments of Charles V and Philip II, looking for guidance on how to handle the succession crisis. He consulted with Spanish legal scholars about the implications of different inheritance choices. This was not a madman talking to corpses. This was a dying king desperately trying to solve an impossible puzzle. His final will, naming Philip of Anjou as his successor, wasn't the random act of a failing mind. It was a calculated decision by a king who understood that keeping the empire intact under French protection was better than letting it fragment among multiple claimants. The night before he signed it, he told his confessor, "I have tried my whole life to be worthy of this crown. If I cannot give Spain a son, perhaps I can give them a future." Charles II died on November 1st, 1700, at age 38. His final weeks were marked not by madness, but by a terrible clarity about what his death would bring. He knew that within months, European armies would be marching across Spain, his empire would be carved up by foreign powers, and 2 centuries of Habsburg dominance were ending with him. His last words, according to multiple witnesses, were not about his pain or his failures, but about his people. "I hope God will help Spain." The autopsy that followed revealed a body so damaged by genetic disease that it seemed impossible he had lived at all. The physician's report described internal organs that were barely functional, a skeletal structure warped by malformation, and evidence of the multiple genetic disorders that had plagued him since birth. But maybe the most remarkable thing isn't how broken Charles was, it's that he kept trying for 38 years to be the king Spain needed. Charles's death triggered exactly the war he had feared. The War of Spanish Succession raged for 13 years, from 1701 to 1714, as the great powers of Europe fought to determine who would control the vast Spanish inheritance. The human cost was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that over 500,000 soldiers and civilians died in the fighting. The empire on which the sun never set had been reduced to Spain itself and its colonial possessions, still substantial, but no longer the dominant force in European politics. Charles II spent 38 years knowing he was failing everyone, his ancestors, his subjects, his empire, but he also spent 38 years refusing to give up. The last Spanish Habsburg died as he had lived, carrying impossible burdens with quiet dignity, offering his broken best to an empire that deserved better, but got something more human instead. In the end, Charles II proved that sometimes the most human thing of all is continuing to try when you know you're not enough.